Many church congregations have had the blessing of commissioning mission workers for service in another culture. It is a great joy. Today, however, we want to focus not on the preparation and departure of workers, but on the return of workers after a term of service, especially those who have been away for a long period of time, perhaps even several years. How can home churches helpfully care for God's servants? That's our topic today on the Global Missions Podcast.
Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a podcast for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes. You can also leave us a message and engage with us through Twitter and Facebook. We would love to hear from you. Here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to his friends as Mags.
Welcome to this episode of the Global Missions Podcast. The interview and show notes include some very practical ideas about how a church can take great care of a missionary family when they return home from the field. Just before we get to that interview, however, I want to remind you that we're coming to the end of our first season of the Global Missions Podcast. Over the months of July and August, we'll be reprising some of our most popular episodes, and then on September 6th, we look forward to launching the second season. We would love your feedback, by the way. If there has been something that you've enjoyed in what you've heard, or you would like to see something changed, would you drop us a line? Facebook, Twitter, or an email from the homepage of our website would be great. Thank you for helping us to grow and improve. Our goal is to serve you well. Now, we'd like to share with you this missions resource.
Do you have your 30 Days of Prayer for the Muslim World booklet yet? If not, please consider joining in this focused month of prayer for our Muslim friends and neighbors. Ramadan, their time of fasting, will start on June 6th this year. It is a time when Muslims are especially spiritually focused, so let us be praying together that they find Jesus. To learn more about this great resource, visit 30daysprayer.com. And now, here's our interview with today's expert guest.
Well, hello again, everyone. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's expert interview. Our guest is Neal Pirolo. And for those of you that haven't had a chance to meet Neal, he is the founder and director of Emmaus Road International, an organization based in the United States that comes alongside churches and agencies and colleges to provide resources that will help ignite and develop and expand involvement in cross-cultural ministries. He is an educator, a pastor, a seminar leader, and an author of several books. In fact, the one that we'll be focusing on today is entitled The Reentry Team, Caring for Your Returning Missionaries. And we're going to ask him today for advice for home churches and for Christians on this side of global missions who want to do an excellent job of serving their missionary workers as they return to their home cultures. Neal, welcome to the program.
It's my privilege to be with you.
I wonder, just before we get into the main topic, if you would just take a couple of minutes to introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about Neal and how you came to be passionate about God's mission.
It is my privilege to have been married and still married to my wife. It will be 59 years next month. Of course, we did get married in preschool, but we did marry quite young.
That's good.
But we now have 4 children who are married, and they have given us 16 grandchildren with many spouses and 15 great-grandchildren. So that is 46 people in my downline. How did we become involved in missions? My very first trip was a disaster. I was just a fill-in for a guy who couldn't go. We almost died twice on our way down to Costa Rica. Everything that could go wrong went wrong. But a couple years later, we went on another trip and everything went right. And being an educator, I went to the School for Missionary Children, and right on the spot, the principal hired me and said, "Come on down." Of course, when the organization was looking at their worldwide situation, They said, you're more needed in Peru than in Colombia. And so our first missionary experience was in Peru. And it just grew from there back to Brazil a few years later for an emergency, filling in their school system there, directing a one-year ministry school with a strong emphasis on cross-cultural outreach. And then in 1983, Emmaus Road International was birthed, and it has been one wild and wonderful ride on the Emmaus Road, encircling the earth, 67 different countries, privileged to write 5 different books. We are enjoying and are definitely passionate about what we're doing.
Mm. Well, today we are going to be talking about supporting God's workers, His servants, His missionaries, particularly as they anticipate coming home to their home culture, and as they arrive, how their supporters and churches can be supportive of them. If we begin in the biblical principles, Neal, that churches and missionaries should be aware of, what is the first step we should be thinking about?
Unfortunately, the time when a missionary comes home is still, so to speak, in the closet. Many different reasons why, but it is an area that we really need to give attention to because unfortunately we lose more missionaries when they come home than when they go to the field. And we have been given 5 simply stated steps that a missionary has to go through in order to have a good reentry. But because they are going through the struggles of the reentry, they need a team of people to help them through those steps. And the first step, the model we find is in Acts chapter 14, where Barnabas and Paul are coming home from their first 2-year venture. When the church and the Holy Spirit sent them out in Acts 13, they didn't say it was going to be a 2-year venture. So when they got to Attalia in Acts chapter 14, verse 25, I don't think they were thinking about going home. They were looking for the synagogue because that was their pattern. But it says when they got to Attalia, they realized that it was time to go home. And that is the first step. A missionary needs to know by God's direction that it's time to go home. That is the first step, and it is the most important step, because if that step doesn't take place, the other 4 steps won't work. And today, more and more, you get an airline ticket that has a 2-year or a visa that's a 2-year, and you know that physically you're going to be home. But if you are not home emotionally, mentally, and spiritually, you might be home physically. But if you are not home emotionally, mentally, and spiritually, you aren't home. If they're just, oh, I wish I were back. Oh, it's so boring here. Oh, I can't do anything. They really aren't home. So they will not have a good reentry. They need to know by God's direction that it's time to be home. And in our book, The Reentry Team, we have a chapter specifically on home not by choice, talking about those emergencies when people are evacuated from the country, and dealing with a person right now in a situation where her friend came to visit her, and while they were climbing some rocks in an area, just a nice outing, the friend that she invited to come fell and died. And you can imagine the trauma that lady is experiencing now. I invited my friend over. She gets killed in an accident. And now this missionary is home trying to sort through all of the issues of that trauma.
In some cases, it will be unexpected and perhaps in response to some type of a crisis that our workers return home. In some cases, it will be a date that is set in advance, especially for home service. Some organizations and churches may call it home service or home assignment or furlough. Once a date has been set and there's an anticipated return for home service or furlough, what are some of the expectations that workers have as they get ready to return back to their homeland?
Again, if they have been well prepared, they will be looking forward to that part of their mission experience, the ability to share what God has done, what is yet to be done, challenging others to get involved either as a goer or to become a better sender, a support person. As Paul said of the Christians at Philippi, though they had never traveled with him, he called them partners in the gospel because they were providing the care for him from home. But some of the attitudes are there's going to be a lot of travel. I'm going to have to smile all the time. People are expecting me to have a positive story, and they're going to look at me as one who wants money. So these are some of the fears that they would experience. The mission team at home, the missions committee or mission task force, again, many different names are being used to express those people from the supporting church. They're going to want to talk. Again, if they have a bad attitude or they don't know what to do with a missionary when they come home, they're going to say, oh, they're going to want to talk, and how are we going to fit them into our already tight schedule? A story that just was republished of Dr. Paul Smith from the People's Church in Toronto. A friend of mine was about to get up to speak on a Sunday morning, and usher came up to Dr. Smith, handed him a note, and he said to my friend, wait a minute, I have some business to take care of. A missionary family had just returned from the field, had come directly from the airport to the church, and Dr. Smith brought them up to the platform. They received a standing ovation from the whole audience because the people knew them. So again, from one extreme of they're going to want to talk, how are we going to fit them into a busy schedule, way to the other extreme of somebody who was well prepared for their missionary family coming home and interrupted the morning service to allow them to come on the platform and have a little interview and show how welcomed home they were by the audience.
What a wonderful story of a congregation. And a shout out to People's Church. Way to go, People's Church. Wonderful to hear that priority. I wonder if you would just take a minute and describe what are some of the expectations that home churches often have of their returning workers?
I think that if they are not prepared, again, we're dealing with different level of preparation among those who are receiving missionaries home. If they're not prepared, they might not know what to do. But if they are prepared, there are so many logistical things that can be done for that missionary, all the way from housing to transportation to a selection of school opportunities for the children, to welcome home in each of the home fellowship groups. There is so much that can be done to welcome them home.
And with some care, a church of just about any size can do a good job of this. Would you agree?
I certainly agree that it doesn't have to be a large church and a large team. Again, referring to the book, there was a story of this missionary said, there was only one person cared for me when I came home. But for his particular situation, that was all that was needed for him. Each situation is so individual, and that's what makes it difficult, because you can't, though there is a biblical pattern of what needs to be done within each of those 5 steps, each individual is going to come at it from a slightly different perspective. Just to go back through those steps, if I may, the second step is they return to their sending church, and that is critical. We have been talking about it as if it's a foregone conclusion, but oftentimes missionaries do not go back to their sending church, and that is dangerous because, for example, one fellow, while they were still on the field, was offered a job at the headquarters office of that agency. So instead of going home, he went directly to that other city. Well, it happened to be a city that had a lot of mission agencies and a lot of missionaries, and they never found a place to have a good reentry. And he wrote to me, he says, Neal, you were right. I should have gone back to my home church first and had a good reentry before starting working in that other city. So they returned to their home church. The third step we find in verse 27, they gathered the church together and they reported all. That's a key word, all. That doesn't happen on 10 minutes and Sunday night or Wednesday night. They reported all that God had done with them and how he had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles. And so there are the two levels of debriefing. The great and glorious stories you can share with the large group, home fellowship, Sunday school classes, civic organizations, a newspaper interview, a radio interview, how God has opened the door of faith to the Gentiles in Paul and Barnabas's case. But the other level of debriefing is the critical one. What has God done in me? That's what the missionary has to be able to verbalize. And that usually happens with a smaller group of people. And then the fourth step is in verse 28. It says they abode a long time with the disciples there. To abide means that you are at home, at rest, at peace with the situation. Where did Barnabas and Saul go that first night? They arrived home, got off the boat. Where did they go? See, that church in Antioch extended hospitality to them. And so this is what the missions committee, the missions task force, the missions team needs to prepare for when a missionary comes home. The fifth step is over in Acts 15, verse 35. It says they were again preaching and teaching at the church in Antioch. In other words, they were fully integrated back into their home church before they went out again. A few verses later, Paul did say, hey, Barney, let's go and check up on those churches we got started.
Right.
But a lot of time happened between 1428 and 1535. They were integrated back into their home church. Now, those who are just on home assignment, planning to go back again, it's a little bit different, but there still has to be that sense of having become accustomed to your home culture. Missionaries have to learn how to become bicultural, comfortable in two different cultures. And that adaptation to back home is going to make it easier for them to return to the field.
Well, it's a very helpful list. That's a good place for me to remind our listeners that we take show notes while these interviews are ongoing. And those 5 steps we will include in the show notes, so you can go and pick that up at the website at globalmissionspodcast.com. Neal, you've mentioned, and of course we want to acknowledge, every individual, every family, every situation is going to be unique. Having said that, to help us, those of us who are here in home churches, to be generally sensitive, what are some of the factors and the hurdles and emotions that mission workers face when they return to their home culture?
They're of necessity going to be thinking about what's going on the field. I had to deal in counseling with one lady who did not want to leave the field because she felt she was so close to leading this person to the Lord. It was in one of those where the women had been abused, and this now was a home for these women and trying to help them sort through their issues and all. And this lady was working with her, but, quote, it was time to go home. And so this lady came home, and she came to me the day after she got the news that this woman committed suicide on the field. Now, you just have to imagine what is going on in her thinking. I mean, theologically, we can say, oh, God is sovereign. Yes, he's in charge. He knew what was going to happen. But that does not help the emotions of that woman who is struggling with, why didn't I stay? If I stayed, maybe she wouldn't have committed suicide. And So everything is so individual. That's why this is such a difficult time in the life of a missionary. You can't just come up with 5 laws and it's all everybody's going to fit into that.
Right.
So each individual has to be dealt with individually. The stories of doing it right, the stories of doing it right are growing. And again, referring to the book, The Reentry Team, which, by the way, is 70 stories written by returned missionaries. And sometimes churches did it right, sometimes they didn't. But it's a study book because after each story, we have a section where these are things you can do to make sure that this happens for your missionary, or if it was not a good story, what to avoid so this doesn't happen. And after one of the stories, I just had to write, just do it. This church did such a phenomenal job of welcoming a family home. As I read the story, and then I called them a couple times just to make sure that this was a true story. It was so phenomenal what that church did. So there are churches that are doing it right. And if they follow those 5 steps, the missionary has to go through them. But if the church has a team of people who will help them through that process, keeping in balance the good and the not so good that happen on the field, so that they will more likely keep in balance the good and the not so good at home, which again is a major factor in them being able to go back to the field. If they fall into the pattern of everything is good at home, everything was bad on the field, they'll never want to go back.
Sure.
So again,
Well, that helps underline the uniqueness of caring for people and actually be discerning for each individual family. I appreciate you mentioned that there's care for missionary kids as well. Sometimes we call them MKs, and there's some great material as well and useful resources. There's another podcast that we did especially on caring for MKs. Individual children respond differently as well. So we're just going forward with care and discernment. You talk about a church being well prepared, Neal, and how important that is. Some churches may assume they have no role to play until a missionary returns to home soil. But what are some of the specific things that churches can or should be doing in anticipation of furlough or home service for workers?
Alerting the congregation by whatever means that they'll be home in 1 month, 3 weeks, whatever, and pictures of the family members, their names, what they've been doing on the field. Of course, it would be good if the church would be doing this on a regular basis the whole time they're on the field. But gearing up more specifically in preparation for that family coming home, our church, the church at which I fellowship, frequently has a Skype, video Skype with one of our missionary families when they are about to come home, so that any new members of the church will be familiar. But a very disastrous thing for a missionary to walk into their home church and the usher hand him the bulletin and say, "Are you a visitor here?" For people in the church to not realize that this is our missionary.
Mm-hmm.
And so preparing the congregation for them coming home, preparing, as I said, apartment or house or transportation, all of those good things logistically, but then also being sensitive that the family may need some alone time to regroup as a family, because oftentimes on the mission field, the family becomes disconnected as a family unit. One missionary family had gone to the field when his children were pre-teen. In fact, they were 5, 6, 7, somewhere around that age. They were going to come home as teenagers. And so their home church very wisely rented a home for them midway between where they had been serving and home. And for 2 weeks, they were allowed to just regroup as a family. and Dad to be able to talk about some of the issues his now teenage kids would be facing in coming home. These are the types of things that a church can do to help prepare that missionary for a good reentry.
Mm-hmm. Something that we've experienced is how busy the last couple of weeks on the field can be prior to a home service. It's a very intensive period of time, sometimes in the ministry, but also emotionally. Saying goodbye to dear friends, whether it's for a year or maybe longer, children saying goodbye to their friends for a year or longer, can be a very intensive time for a family, and to bless them with some space to process some of those experiences is a very caring step. Well, Neal, I appreciate you've mentioned your book here, and I want to just recommend this too. It's very readable. The Reentry Team, as Neal mentioned, it's full of stories that really help illustrate various healthy principles for congregations and for believers who want to really take care of their missionary workers. Neal, are there other books or resources that you would recommend to our listeners on this topic?
There are a number of books about reentry. They are written to the missionary. There's a book called Burn Up or Splash Down, and then an old classic by Peter Jordan called Reentry, and then Returning Well by Melissa Chaplin, which is a 2015 publication. These three books talk to the missionary and give them some insight as to what they can expect in coming home, whereas the Reentry Team, I believe, stands out from those because it is not talking to the missionary, but it is talking to the Reentry Team who are going to help the missionary through those 5 steps of a good reentry.
Right. It's more for those of us at home to equip and prepare us to do a good job.
That's right. Although I have had missionaries, Neal, that book, Reentry, just reading those stories made me realize that I'm not crazy. So a lot of missionaries have also appreciated the stories, particularly the chapter on silly little things, all those silly little things that you just aren't prepared for. And unfortunately, when silly little things build upon each other, and all of a sudden it would just be a silly little thing, but the buildup is so great that they just have a bad reaction to that silly little thing. Mm-hmm. But it isn't that one thing that did it. It was the buildup of so many things that happened unexpectedly. Mm-hmm. It's challenging, but it is such a rewarding experience to work with missionaries when they are coming home. Powerful to the worker's own spiritual well-being to be able to help a missionary have a good reentry.
I wonder if our listeners would like to explore this more. How can they follow you or be in touch with you or learn more?
The best place would be our website, which is simply eri.org. Or we're on Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn. But I think the best place is come to our website, and our email contact is there, our phone number if you want to be more directly in contact with us.
Very good.
It would be our privilege to work with you. I would just mention that on our website, for those of you in Canada, if you go to order any of our books, there's a button to press where you can order it from our Canadian distributor.
We hope you found today's interview to be both informative and inspiring. If you missed anything or would like to check out the resources or links mentioned during the interview, you can find the show notes we've prepared at our website, globalmissionspodcast.com. You can also use the website or our Facebook page to suggest a particular topic or expert you'd like to hear featured on this program. The Global Missions Podcast is co-sponsored by the Jaffrey Centre for Global Initiatives and Send International of Canada. Thanks for listening in. I'm your host, Mags, and I invite you to join us again in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.